Well, it is Wednesday, March 5th, 2025, and things are pretty interesting in the world of politics after President Trump's return to the Oval Office. It's been a whirlwind first month back, and of course, he just gave his first address to Congress. We've got a few articles here from the Videntis, and we're going to try to unpack what's been going on. So we've got Trump declares golden age in first Congress speech, and we've also got Trump delivers historic 90-minute address to Congress. That's interesting.
90 minutes.
The 90-minute speech, that's a long time.
Longest in over 60 years.
That's what they're saying, the longest in over 60 years. And then this one, Trump vows to plant flag on Mars amid rising egg prices.
Wow.
So, I mean, these articles are a lot to unpack. I mean, a golden age, 90 minutes, a flag on Mars.
And egg prices.
And egg prices. So what happens when a president known for making bold pronouncements meets a nation facing rising costs and deep political divides? That's what we're going to try to figure out today.
Well, you know, what I think is so interesting is just the sheer volume of activity coming out of the White House. I mean, 70 executive orders in just 1 month.
Oh, wow.
That's got to be a record, right?
Yeah, I think that's going to be some kind of record, for sure.
It's unprecedented, and this massive speech laying out a vision for America, well, let's just say it's a classic Trump.
It certainly is classic Trump. So let's start with that golden age declaration, The article highlights Trump's focus on economic policies and, of course, the eyebrow-raising plan to plant a flag on Mars. But it also mentions his stance on transgender issues and some pretty pointed rhetoric. What's your overall take on this message that's coming out of the White House?
It's a mix, right? You've got ambition, you've got, frankly, some inflammatory language that seems designed to further divide a nation that's already so polarized. The Golden Age rhetoric, it feels almost nostalgic, like hearkening back to a time of perceived American dominance. But the reality is we're facing serious challenges. You know, inflation, international tensions, you name it.
Yeah.
And this speech seemed to kind of gloss over all of that in favor of these grand pronouncements and a return to America First policies.
Yeah, and speaking of those policies, 70 executive orders is a lot to digest.
Yeah.
What are some of the key ones that jumped out at you? And what kind of impact are we already seeing from these?
Yeah. There's the halt on offshore wind energy leasing, which has a lot of environmental groups up in arms.
Yeah.
Then you've got the directive on AI development, which is raising some concerns about, you know, potential job displacement and ethical considerations.
Right.
And of course, there are those tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China, which, you know, have the potential to spark trade wars and further destabilize the global economy.
Yeah, it seems like he hit the ground running and didn't even bother to slow down at all. And then there's Elon Musk, heading up the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE as they're calling it. He's already shaking things up with those mass resignation packages for federal employees. What is going on there?
It's pretty aggressive, I mean. The article mentioned 9,500 job cuts already, and that number is likely to climb. Trump is praising him, you know, for streamlining government. But then you have critics accusing him of gutting essential services and undermining the federal workforce.
Yeah. It's a bold move for sure, but it makes you wonder, how much influence does Musk actually have within this administration? I mean, is this just about efficiency, or is there something bigger at play here?
That's a great question, and it's something worth considering. I mean, the articles don't explicitly detail the extent of Musk's influence beyond DOGE, but his close relationship with Trump suggests that it could be pretty significant, right?
Yeah.
I mean, remember, this is a president who values loyalty and has often surrounded himself with individuals who share his vision, even if their qualifications are questionable.
Yeah, you're right. And Musk certainly fits that mold in some ways, that's for sure. But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about their reaction to all of this. The article describing the speech itself paints a pretty vivid picture of the partisan divide in Congress. What was it like in that room?
It was stark, very stark. Republicans offering standing ovations, Democrats protesting, even to the point of Representative Al Green being removed from the chamber.
Wow.
It's a clear sign that Trump is facing an uphill battle in getting his agenda through Congress, right? I mean, compromise and negotiation, they don't really seem to be part of his playbook, and that could lead to more gridlock and further division.
Yeah, it's like a replay of his first term in some ways, but maybe even more intense this time around. Okay, before we move on, I have to ask about that Mars mission. It just seems so out there, especially with so many immediate problems here on Earth. Is this a realistic goal or just a distraction?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, the articles don't go into the specifics of how such a mission would be funded or executed, but it's safe to say it would be incredibly expensive and technologically challenging. And yes, it does feel like a distraction from more pressing issues facing the nation, like the rising cost of living and the growing gap between the rich and the poor.
Right. It's hard to get excited about planting a flag on Mars when you're struggling to put food on the table. But perhaps that's part of the strategy, right? To offer a grand vision that distracts from the more mundane realities. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out in the long run, but for now, let's take a closer look at some of the key players in this unfolding drama, starting with Elon Musk.
Musk is a fascinating figure, isn't he? Brilliant, ambitious, and clearly not afraid to shake things up, but his track record is also, let's just say, inconsistent.
That's putting it mildly, for sure. From Tesla to SpaceX to, well, Twitter, he's had his share of successes and controversies. So what's his game here with the OGE? Is he genuinely trying to make government more efficient, or is this about something else entirely?
It's tough to say for sure. On the one hand, he's clearly brought a private sector mindset to government, emphasizing metrics and streamlining processes and cutting costs. And I think there's an argument to be made that some level of bureaucracy needs to be trimmed, right?
Right.
But the speed and scale of these cuts are alarming to a lot of people. We're talking essential services, regulatory agencies, even scientific research programs are being impacted. It's too early to tell what the long-term consequences will be. But there's definitely a risk of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak.
Yeah, and the optics of it all are pretty striking. You have a billionaire tech CEO essentially dismantling parts of the federal government with the full support of a president who's often seen as out of touch with the average American. It feeds into this narrative that the system is rigged in favor of the wealthy and powerful.
Absolutely, and that narrative is further fueled by those tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China. The articles highlight the potential economic fallout, both domestically and internationally. We're already seeing pushback from those countries, and there's a real risk a trade war that could hurt everyone involved.
Yeah, it's like he's deliberately antagonizing our allies while simultaneously cozying up to figures like Putin. It's a foreign policy approach that's baffling to a lot of experts, to say the least. But let's go back to that Mars mission for a moment. Setting aside the feasibility and the cost, what kind of message does this send to the rest of the world?
It's a mixed message, for sure. On the one hand, it signals a return to American ambition on the global stage, a desire to reclaim our position as a leader in space exploration. But on the other hand, it can be seen as a retreat from global engagement, a focus on nationalistic pursuits rather than international cooperation. And it certainly doesn't help our image when we're cutting funding for climate change research while promising to plant a flag on Mars.
It's almost like two competing narratives playing out at the same time.
Yeah.
The Golden Age rhetoric, the Mars mission, it's all very grand and aspirational. But then you have the tariffs, the social policies, the divisive language. It's a recipe for conflict and instability.
Exactly. And that tension is what makes this moment so fascinating and frankly a bit unnerving. It's really hard to predict what will happen next, but one thing is for sure, we're in for a wild ride.
So let's zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture. What are some of the key takeaways from all of this? And what should we be paying attention to in the coming weeks and months?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that we're witnessing a pretty fundamental shift in the political landscape. Trump's return to power has emboldened a certain segment of the population, and we're seeing a resurgence of nationalist populist sentiment, not just in the US, but around the world. And that's creating a lot of uncertainty and anxiety.
Yeah, it feels like the old rules no longer apply and we're in uncharted territory. So what should we be watching for specifically?
I think it's important to keep an eye on a few key areas. First, the economy. Those tariffs are already having an impact, and we need to see how that plays out in the long run. Second, the social and political landscape. Trump is pushing a very divisive agenda, and it's important to track how that's impacting the country's social fabric. And finally, the international arena. Trump's foreign policy is unpredictable and often confrontational, and we need to be prepared for potential conflicts and crises.
It's a lot to take in and can feel overwhelming at times. But knowledge is power, right? The more we understand what's happening, the better equipped we'll be to navigate these turbulent times.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that we're not powerless. We can stay informed, engage in dialogue, and hold our leaders accountable. The future is not predetermined, and our actions can make a difference.
It's definitely a lot to process, and it feels like the stakes are higher than ever. But you're right. Staying informed and engaged is so crucial. So before we wrap up this deep dive, let's circle back to that Mars mission one last time. Setting aside all the practical concerns, is there any symbolic value in this kind of grand ambition? Could it be a unifying force for a nation that seems increasingly fractured?
That's a really interesting question. Historically, space exploration has often served as a source of national pride and inspiration, a way to rally people around a common goal. And in a time of such deep division, perhaps that's what we need, a reminder that we're all in this together, that there are still frontiers to explore and challenges to overcome.
Yeah, it's like that old saying, if you want to build a ship, don't drum up the men to gather wood, divide the work, and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea. Maybe that's what Trump is trying to do here, to tap into that sense of wonder and possibility.
It's possible, but the question is, will it resonate with the majority of Americans, especially those who are struggling to make ends meet? A flag on Mars won't put food on the table or lower the cost of healthcare. And it's hard to escape the feeling that this is more about symbolism than substance, a way to distract from the very real problems facing the nation.
So where does that leave us? We've got a president pushing an ambitious agenda, a Congress that is deeply divided, and a public grappling with economic anxieties and a sense of unease about the future. What's your overall assessment of this first month back in the Oval Office?
Oh, it's been turbulent, to say the least. Trump has wasted no time in asserting his authority, both domestically and internationally. And while some may applaud his decisive action and bold vision, others are deeply concerned about the direction he's taking the country. Only time will tell what the long-term consequences will be, but one thing is clear. We're in for a period of significant change and uncertainty.
Well, that's certainly a thought-provoking note to end on. As always, we encourage our listeners to stay informed, engage in critical thinking, and draw their own conclusions. After all, an informed citizenry is essential for a healthy democracy. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into President Trump's first month back in office. We'll be back soon with more news and analysis. Until then, stay curious and stay engaged.